All right, guys, so this next video is going to cover the relationship between exercise dependence and eating disorders. And before we do anything else, I want you to watch this exercise clip at the top of the slide. There's a link. Exercise bulimia. When you're done with that, come back to the video and listen to the rest of my lecture. See you soon. All right. So I hope that you first, before you came back to the video, watched that video segment on exercise as it relates to bulimia in particular. And that will make the rest of what I'm saying have more meaning because you just watched a video documentary clip of individuals suffering from bulimia who also have exercise dependence. So in this case, we are talking about exercise dependency co-occurring with an eating disorder, in this case bulimia on the video clip that I showed you. People are exercising along with the excessive exercise behavior is happening in co-occurrence with the other eating disorder symptomology that is being used to try to control the weight gain from the binges, right? Vomiting, laxatives, fasting, all to avoid the consequences of the excessive caloric intake during the binge cycle. Remember from last class, we're talking here upwards of 10,000 calories in a single binge, high fat, high sugar comfort foods. So the exercise excess is being used to facilitate the purge, along with these other unhealthy activities designed to do the same thing, like self-induced vomiting, laxative abuse, fasting, etc. This has been reported not only in women, which is what folks more commonly assume, but also in college males. Now, one of the controversies about secondary exercise addiction is some researchers have argued it co-occurs so frequently with eating disorders like bulimia that it's impossible to separate the process of exercise addiction without an eating disorder. They argue that exercise addiction is always part of an eating disorder. They argue, in other words, they find it dubious that there's such a thing as primary exercise addiction, because typically they argue when we see exercise dependence, there is inevitably an eating disorder that's also being suffered by the individual. And so they argue it's impossible to untangle exercise dependency from eating disorder pathology. They argue that participants exercise typically for folks who don't also have a co-occurring eating disorder is not creating the level of subjective distress that is normally associated with addictive processes as it is in people who also have a co-occurring eating disorder. So this is one of the major controversies, whether there really is such a thing as a primary exercise addiction in the absence of an eating disorder. Now, when exercise addiction and eating disorders do occur together, the danger is that only one problem will be treated. So one of the reasons that some clinicians prefer to treat exercise addiction as something that happens separately but can be comorbid with eating disorders rather than part of eating disorder pathology is the fear that only the eating disorder will be treated and not the excessive exercise dependency that might continue then after the eating disorder symptoms are being properly controlled, and then that will lead to its own problems in the individual's life. Often the eating disorder, which is the better known, that's in the DSM-5, as I told you, exercise addiction is technically not recognized yet as a behavioral addiction. It's seen as something potentially for further study that could be recognized in a future DSM. So the eating disorder is typically, since it is diagnosable in the DSM, that's the better known disorder. That becomes the focus of treatment. And then the secondary exercise addiction remains hidden. But nonetheless, when the patient begins to eat in a more healthful way and restore body weight and stop abusing things like laxatives and things of that nature, begins to change his or her cognitions. Remember, we talked about distorted cognitions, with regard to eating disorder patterns when we talked in our last class, even though those things are beginning to respond to treatment, oftentimes the patient is still not gaining weight as would be expected. And that's because the exercise regimen, the exercise dependency is not being managed in treatment. And so that's another reason that some clinicians fear if we just treat eating disorders and exercise addiction like part of the same pathology, then the exercise addiction is not going to be recognized enough as a target for separate treatment focus. Okay, so I will see you on the next slide. Catch you there.